Imagine waking up to the deafening silence of a battlefield. Outside the massive stone walls of your city, the most ruthless, unstoppable army the ancient world has ever seen has been waiting to slaughter you. You went to sleep expecting to die, listening to the terrifying sounds of 185,000 enemy soldiers sharpening their swords, chanting their war cries, and preparing to breach your gates. But as the sun rises, you look over the stone battlements and see something entirely impossible. The sprawling enemy camp is completely still. There are no war cries. There are no clashing swords. There is absolutely no movement. Instead, scattered across the horizon as far as the eye can see, lie 185,000 dead soldiers. Not a single arrow was fired by your men. Not a single sword was drawn by your army. The greatest military machine on earth was completely wiped out in a single night, in absolute, terrifying silence. This is not a myth. This is one of the most astonishing, historically corroborated events in the ancient world. The night the angel of the Lord walked into the Assyrian camp, and Jerusalem was saved without a battle. How did this happen? What exactly took place in the dead of night? And who was the terrifying entity that single-handedly dismantled an empire's pride? To understand the sheer magnitude of this miracle, you have to understand the nightmare that was the Assyrian Empire. In the 8th century BC, Assyria was the undisputed apex predator of the Middle East. They were not just conquerors, they were architects of terror. When the Assyrians marched on a nation, they didn't just want to defeat its army, they wanted to break its soul. They perfected the art of psychological warfare long before the term even existed. They were famous for flaying their enemies alive, impaling captured leaders on spikes outside the city gates, and deporting entire populations to erase their cultural identity forever. If you fought the Assyrians, you didn't just lose your land, you lost your existence. At the helm of this unstoppable war machine was King Sennacherib. Sennacherib was brilliant, arrogant, and ruthlessly efficient. He had already crushed the northern kingdom of Israel, dragging the 10 tribes into an exile from which they would never return. Now, his eyes were set on the southern kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. Sennacherib began a systematic, brutal campaign through Judah. He didn't just march straight to Jerusalem. He took his time, dismantling the fortified cities of Judah one by one. 46 walled cities fell to the Assyrian battering rams. The most devastating blow came at Lachish, Judah's second most important city. Sennacherib built massive siege ramps, rolled up heavy battering rams, and unleashed a storm of arrows and fire. Lachish was utterly destroyed. The Assyrians were so proud of this massacre that Sennacherib later had the entire siege carved into the stone walls of his palace in Nineveh, depicting Judean captives being tortured and led away with hooks in their noses. This was the message he was sending to Jerusalem. Look at Lachish. This is what happens when you resist. You are next. Inside Jerusalem, King Hezekiah watched the smoke rising from Lachish. The situation was beyond desperate. Hezekiah was a good king, a reformer who had torn down the pagan altars and turned his nation back to the God of Israel. But right now, piety seemed like a weak defense against iron and fire. Jerusalem was completely isolated. The Egyptian army, which Hezekiah had hoped might come to his aid, was useless. The Assyrians had locked down the entire region. Jerusalem was trapped. Sennacherib didn't even bother coming to Jerusalem himself at first. He was too busy enjoying his victory at Lachish. Instead, he sent a massive detachment of his army, led by his top military officials, including a man known by his title, the Rabshakeh. The Rabshakeh was the ancient equivalent of a chief propagandist, a master of psychological manipulation. He marched up to the walls of Jerusalem with a massive, intimidating force and demanded an audience. Hezekiah sent 3 of his top officials out to meet the Rabshakeh, but the Assyrian commander had no intention of having a quiet diplomatic chat. He wanted the people of Jerusalem to hear every single word. He wanted to bypass the government and inject pure terror directly into the veins of the starving citizens on the wall. The Judean officials begged the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic, the language of diplomacy, so the common people wouldn't understand, but the Rabshakeh refused. He stepped forward and shouted in fluent Hebrew, ensuring that every terrified man, woman, and child on the wall could hear him perfectly. His speech was a masterpiece of demoralization. He didn't just attack their military weakness, he attacked their faith. He mocked their reliance on Egypt, calling it a splintered reed that would pierce the hand of anyone who leaned on it. He mocked their military, offering to give them 2,000 horses if they could even find enough riders to put on them, but his most devastating attack was aimed directly at their God. He shouted to the people on the wall, telling them not to let Hezekiah deceive them. He told them that Hezekiah's faith was a death sentence. Then, the Rabshakeh dropped the ultimate psychological bomb. He asked a question that hung in the air like a suffocating smoke. Has any god of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Did they deliver Samaria from my hand? Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save his land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? It was a terrifyingly logical argument. The Assyrians had crushed every nation they faced. Every nation had its own gods, and every single one of those gods had failed to stop the Assyrian war machine. Why would the God of Israel be any different? The Rabshakeh was telling them that their God was just one more pathetic deity waiting to be crushed under the boots of the Assyrian army. He offered the people on the wall a twisted alternative: surrender. Come out to me, and I will take you to a land just like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. Surrender and live. Resist and eat your own waste and drink your own urine in the horrors of the coming siege. The people on the wall remained completely silent, just as King Hezekiah had commanded them, but inside, their hearts were melting with fear. The Judean officials tore their clothes in despair and went back to report the devastating words to Hezekiah. When Hezekiah heard the report, he didn't call a war council. He didn't summon his generals to discuss tactics. He knew that militarily the war was already lost. There was no strategy that could defeat the Assyrian army. Instead, Hezekiah tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and went straight into the temple of the Lord. He sent a desperate message to the prophet Isaiah, asking him to pray for the remnant that was left. Isaiah's response was immediate and shocking in its confidence. He told Hezekiah not to be afraid of the words he had heard, the words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria had blasphemed God. Isaiah prophesied that God would put a certain spirit in Sennacherib, that he would hear a rumor, return to his own country, and be cut down with the sword in his own land. It was a bold promise, but the Assyrian army was still outside the walls, and the threat was far from over. Sennacherib, hearing that the king of Egypt was finally marching out to fight him, decided he needed to finish off Jerusalem quickly. He sent a letter directly to Hezekiah. This wasn't a speech shouted at the walls. This was a formal, written decree of doom. The letter repeated the same arrogant blasphemy. It warned Hezekiah not to let his God deceive him. It listed all the kings and nations Assyria had utterly destroyed. It was a written guarantee of annihilation. Hezekiah took this terrifying letter, walked into the temple, and did something incredibly profound. He literally spread the letter out before the Lord. He didn't pray for military strategy. He didn't even primarily pray for his own life. Hezekiah prayed for the reputation of God. He acknowledged that the Assyrians had indeed laid waste to all the other nations and thrown their gods into the fire. But then he made the crucial distinction. He said, "They destroyed those gods because they were not gods at all, but only wood and stone, the work of human hands. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, Lord, are the only God." Hezekiah shifted the battlefield. This was no longer a war between Assyria and Judah. This was now a war between Sennacherib and the creator of the universe. Sennacherib thought he was fighting a localized deity. He was about to find out he had picked a fight with the Almighty. God's response came swiftly through the prophet Isaiah. The message was a poetic, devastating takedown of Assyrian pride. God mocked Sennacherib. He told the Assyrian king that the virgin daughter of Zion despises you and mocks you. She tosses her head as you flee. God reminded Sennacherib that the only reason Assyria had been successful was because God had ordained it. Assyria was nothing but a tool in the hand of God, an axe boasting against the one who swings it. And then came the absolute guarantee of protection. God said concerning the king of Assyria, "He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city. I will defend this city and save it, for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant." Imagine being a soldier on the wall of Jerusalem that night. The prophecy has been spoken, but the reality outside the wall is terrifying. The Assyrian camp is vast. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tents, horses, chariots, and the glowing embers of countless campfires stretching out into the darkness. The smell of smoke and roasted meat drifts over the walls. The sound of a massive army settling in for the night echoes through the valleys. You know that tomorrow the battering rams will roll forward. Tomorrow the arrows will block out the sun. Tomorrow the slaughter begins. The tension is suffocating. Jerusalem is a locked cage, waiting for the butcher. But as the night deepened, something happened in the Assyrian camp. The biblical text describes it with chilling brevity. It doesn't give us a long, drawn-out battle scene. It doesn't describe thunder and lightning. It simply says, "That night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp." Who was this angel of the Lord? In the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord is not a chubby cherub with a harp. He is a terrifying, lethal entity, often appearing as the commander of the armies of heaven. Some theologians believe this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, a Christophany. Others view it as a high-ranking angelic being executing God's direct judgment. Whatever the theological specifics, the result was absolute devastation. This being moved through the massive Assyrian camp in total silence. There was no clash of steel. There were no screams of battle. No alarms were sounded. No defensive lines were formed. The greatest military force on the planet was systematically, flawlessly, and silently eradicated. We don't know exactly how they died. Was it a sudden supernatural plague? Was it a breath of divine judgment that stopped their hearts in their sleep? The text simply says they were put to death. 185,000 men, elite archers, battle-hardened infantry, ruthless commanders, and brilliant tacticians, all of them gone in a single night. When the people of Jerusalem woke up the next morning, they prepared for the worst. They expected the sound of trumpets and the roar of the charge. Instead, they heard nothing. The silence must have been more terrifying than the noise. At first, a silent enemy is an unpredictable enemy. But as the sun rose higher, the watchmen on the walls peered out into the valleys. The tents were still there. The chariots were still there. But the men were dead. The biblical account states, when the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. The sheer scale of this deliverance is staggering. Jerusalem didn't have to fight. They didn't have to negotiate. They didn't have to surrender. The enemy that had terrified the known world, the empire that had erased entire civilizations, was broken overnight by a single unseen agent of God. The arrogance of Sennacherib, the blasphemy of the Rabshakeh, the terror of Lachish, all of it was silenced in the dark. King Sennacherib was not among the dead. He survived the night, only to wake up to the ultimate nightmare of any military commander. His invincible army was a graveyard. His power was broken. The prophecy of Isaiah had come true with terrifying precision. Sennacherib didn't shoot a single arrow into Jerusalem. He didn't build a single siege ramp against its walls. Utterly humiliated and stripped of his military might, he broke camp and fled back to his capital city of Nineveh. But what makes this biblical account even more fascinating is how it aligns with secular history. If you go to the British Museum today, you can see an ancient clay cylinder known as the Taylor Prism. It contains the royal annals of King Sennacherib of Assyria, written in cuneiform. In this official Assyrian record, Sennacherib boasts about his campaign in Judah. He lists the 46 fortified cities he conquered. He boasts about the plunder he took. But when it comes to Jerusalem, the record suddenly shifts. Sennacherib does not claim to have conquered Jerusalem. He does not claim to have defeated Hezekiah in battle. Instead, he writes this bizarre, face-saving line. "As for Hezekiah the Judahite, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem." Think about that. The most boastful, arrogant king in the ancient world, a man who carved the gruesome details of his victories into the walls of his palace, suddenly stops at Jerusalem. He claims he trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but he never claims he opened the cage. He never claims he took the city. Why would the unstoppable Assyrian army trap a king in his capital and then just pack up and go home? Ancient kings never recorded their defeats. They spun them into propaganda. Sennacherib couldn't admit that his army was annihilated by a supernatural force, so he simply recorded the siege and conveniently left out the ending. The silence of the Assyrian record regarding the fall of Jerusalem is one of the loudest historical confirmations of the biblical text. You cannot spin 185,000 dead soldiers, so you just don't mention them. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, a defeated man. He had mocked the God of Israel, claiming that the Lord was no different than the gods of wood and stone that he had burned in the fire. But God had the final word. The prophecy of Isaiah stated that Sennacherib would return to his own land and be cut down with the sword. Years later, as Sennacherib was worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch, the very god he believed had given him all his victories, his own sons, Adramelech and Sharezer, drew their swords and assassinated him. The king who had mocked the living God died bleeding out on the floor of a pagan temple, murdered by his own flesh and blood, unable to be saved by the idol he was bowing to. The irony is as profound as it is tragic. Hezekiah prayed in the temple of the living God and was saved. Sennacherib prayed in the temple of a false god and was slaughtered. The night the angel of the Lord saved Jerusalem stands as one of the most powerful testaments to divine intervention in human history. It is a story that proves that no matter how vast the enemy, no matter how loud the taunts, and no matter how impossible the odds, the ultimate power does not rest in chariots, horses, or human empires. The Assyrians built an empire on terror and intimidation, believing they were the masters of the earth. But in a single night, without a single sword drawn by the defenders of Jerusalem, God reminded the world who truly holds history in his hands. The silence that fell over the Assyrian camp that morning still echoes today. It is a reminder that when the enemy is at the gates, when the psychological warfare is at its peak, and when all human hope is lost, one word from the Almighty is enough to shatter the strongest armies on earth. The cage was locked, the bird was trapped, but the cage belonged to God, and he alone decides who lives and who falls in the dark.